Good morning, everybody. This is a wonderful, wonderful turnout for an 8 o'clock session. I'm extremely grateful for that, as are all of our panelists. I'm also extremely pleased to be chairing this panel, Scientific Fieldwork in France and the World in the 18th and 19th Centuries. Before I begin, I just wanted to say that the Journal of the Western Society for French History has a call for papers out, and that to make sure to remind people that if they want to revise papers and submit them to the journal, that's a real possibility, and I have some Xeroxes here, but I'm sure it's on the website as well. Okay, our first presenter today, Dena Goodman, of course, requires no introduction. The two panels in her honor at this meeting have attested to her great generosity as a teacher, scholar, and contributor to the profession. And here I'm thinking specifically about her presidency of the Western, as well as her presidency of the American Society of 18th Century Studies, and of course the work that she's done as a leader on the Encyclopedia Project. We talked about that a lot in the panels yesterday, as really changing how we teach the Enlightenment. Since receiving her doctorate at the University of Chicago, she has published several books, edited or co-edited several volumes, and published articles in the field's leading journals. Before retiring, she was the Lila Miller Collegiate Professor of History and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Her talk today is Linnaeus and the practice of fieldwork in revolutionary France.
Everybody for coming. 8 o'clock, last day, we can do this. The Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus, who, for those of you who are not Linnaeus fans, 1707 to 1778, had an enormous impact on the practice of natural history throughout Europe and indeed throughout the world in the 18th century. But much later, it turns out, in France than elsewhere. Historians of science have explained the delay in the adoption of Linnaeus's ideas in France, or rather, I should be more specific, in Paris, because apparently he was adopted in the provinces. They've explained the delay in the adoption of Linnaeus's ideas in terms of a rivalry with Buffon, whose power and influence as director of the Jardin du Roi served as a bulwark against Linnaean science until the 1790s. In this narrative, the Revolution of 1789, following close on the death of Buffon in 1788, brought an end to the old regime of Buffonian natural history. Even though the Academy of Sciences managed to shut down the fledgling Société Linnéenne in May of 1789, its successors, the Société Philomatique, founded in December 1788, and the Société d'Histoire Naturelle, founded in August 1790, would ultimately triumph with the fall of the academies in 1793. In this paper, I would like to reframe the question of Linnaeus's influence in France by shifting the focus away from institutional and ideological battles about scientific language and classification that pit Linnaeans against Buffonians, marginalized individuals against powerful institutions, and French arrogance against universal truths. Instead of looking at Linnaean science as a wave that was forcibly stopped from flowing across France until the death of Buffon and the collapse of the old regime, I want to consider Linnaeus as a positive model that was positively adopted by young men in the 1790s with enthusiasm. By focusing on fieldwork as the central practice of Linnaean science, rather than on classification and nomenclature as its key intellectual contributions to the history of science, I will argue that Linnaeus provided a patriotic, masculine model of science that was especially attractive to young men when France was in revolution and at war. And I don't know about you, but I started thinking, where did I get that idea about Linnaeus? And I thought, that's Foucault. So I don't have time to go into the Foucault part, but just remember where that idea and that narrative comes from. And if you go back and read Les Mots et les Choses, you will find it. You will find lots of other places, but for those of us who are not historians of science, Foucault gave us that narrative, I think. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about Foucault, but I do want to get Rousseau out of the way. Pascal Duris, the author of Linnaeus en France, published in 1993, has called Rousseau, quote, the artisan in France of the popularization of Linnaean ideas, even though his major writings on this topic were not published until after his death. That's Rousseau, not Duris. In 1786, the Journal de Paris published a 1771 letter from Rousseau to Linnaeus in which he called himself, quote, the most zealous of your disciples. In the Confessions, Rousseau called Linnaeus a, quote, great observer who views botany, quote, as a naturalist and a philosopher. But Rousseau criticized Linnaeus as well, complaining that he had studied too much in herbaria and in gardens and not enough in nature itself. This is a curious critique, since, as I will show, fieldwork was not only central to Linnaeus's practice of science, but key to his persona as a scientist and a teacher. Where Rousseau really parted ways with Linnaeus was in his understanding of nature and the relationship of botany to it. Whereas Linnaeus argued for the utility of botany, Rousseau called it, quote, a study of pure curiosity that has no other real utility than that which a thinking and sensible being can draw from the observation of nature and the wonders of the universe. Whereas Linnaeus saw botany as part of an economy of nature that through human art and action was the foundation of the economy of the nation, Rousseau saw human intervention in nature as a violation, a, quote, what he called a deformation of nature for human purposes. Finally, for Rousseau, nature was a refuge from the masculine world of competition, striving, knowledge, and achievement. Botany's value was primarily, not surprisingly, moral and aesthetic, not political, economic, or intellectual. It was what he called a study for an idle and lazy solitary person. This is from the Reveries. It should thus not surprise us that Rousseau's version of Linnaeus was both feminized and especially popular with women. After Rousseau, Pascal Duris writes, women maintained a privileged relationship with the natural sciences and with botany in particular. So in the rest of this talk, I want to show that for Linnaeus, by contrast, botany and natural history more generally was a masculine, sociable, patriotic endeavor of supreme utility, and that this is what made natural history attractive to many young men during and after the French Revolution. All right, so Linnaeus. On October 17, 1741, Linnaeus delivered his inaugural address at the University of Uppsala on the necessity of traveling in one's own country. In it he declared, and this is a long quote, the natural philosopher, the mineralogist, the botanist, the zoologist, the physician, the farmer, and all others initiated in any part of natural knowledge may find in traveling through our own country things which they will own they never dreamed of before. Nay, things which to this day were never discovered by any person whatever. Lastly, such things as may not only gratify and satiate their curiosity, but may be of service to themselves, their country, and all the world. For Linnaeus, the university with its libraries and collections, because this is, after all, his inaugural address as a professor, the university with its libraries and collections laid the foundations for the fieldwork where knowledge is produced, and travel through one's own country, in turn, laid the foundation for travel abroad. This subject, travel abroad, Linnaeus took up several years later in the, my Latin is non-existent, Instructio Peregrinatoris, the most influential guide for how to conduct scientific travel across the globe in the 18th century, and the model for all subsequent such guides. Both essays were published in his Amenitates Academici, a multi-volume collection of dissertations written by Linnaeus's students and generally ascribed to him. In fact, he took credit for them. Benjamin Stillingfleet opened the volume of selections from the Amenitates that he published in English in 1775 with Linnaeus's inaugural address. So it's really important for framing his work. After lauding Linnaeus for the system of classification and nomenclature that he had invented and for all the plants, animals, and minerals he had identified, Stillingfleet acknowledged the importance of Linnaeus's travels. Besides his writings, of which I have mentioned but a small part, Stillingfleet wrote, this indefatigable man, born to be nature's historian, has traveled over Lapland, all Sweden, part of Norway, Denmark, Germany, Holland, England, and France in search of knowledge. End of the quote. Inspired by him, Linnaeus's students had traveled even further across the globe. Quote, When we consider him in this light, a master of such disciples as these and many others, some of whose works make up the following book, he must appear like Homer at the head of the poets, Socrates at the head of the Greek moralists, and our Newton at the head of the mathematical philosophers. That was his conclusion. Also included in the Amenitates was Herbationes Upsaliensis, a description of 8 field trips in the area around Uppsala on which Linnaeus took his students at the end of each spring term. And here is how the historian Hanna Hodach describes these expeditions. This is a very long quote, but since this text has never been translated into French or English, and I don't read Latin, so I only have her version of it, but it's great. They arrived in the early morning, as many as 200 or 300 students, with horns, banners, and drums. The cold May air and dew-damp ground would be offset by the excitement and anticipation of the growing crowd. Even at the last minute, there was much to do. The sharpshooters tended their guns. Someone had to be appointed to write the protocol, others to supervise the crowd, to lead the way and to marshal the stragglers. And then in the center of everything was Carolus Linnaeus himself. And so off they went. The drums driving them on like a search party, scanning the landscape for material, eyes on the ground, uprooting plants and shooting birds and any other wild animals unfortunate enough to cross their paths. They collected minerals and insects too. Every half hour they stopped and gathered around Linnaeus to hear a lecture on the samples the neophytes had harvested. At the end of the day, students and professor would return together, processing through the streets of Uppsala, now in a tighter pack, drums beating louder, horns sounding more clamorously than ever. Le Finale, an endless chorus outside Linnaeus' house. Viva Linnaeus. This, I would argue, was the Linnaeus who inspired the members of the Société d'Histoire Naturelle and the Société Philomatique. The Société d'Histoire Naturelle organized a series of expeditions in the Paris region, clearly modeled on Linnaeus' Herbationes Upsaliensis, and using the methodical approach Linnaeus had employed in his journeys throughout Sweden in the 1730s and 40s. On November 18, 1791, and I'm quoting here from the minutes of the Society, the president reminded the assembly of its commitment to do the natural history of the department, whose boundaries it had determined that it was time to begin its excursions. Each member then signed up for one of the realms of nature. There were 17 who signed up as mineralogists, 18 botanists, and 13 zoologists. And the following week, leaders were designated for each team. The first excursion took place 2 days later, and at the following meeting, they met weekly, the leaders presented their reports and deposited and discussed their finds. Weekly excursions throughout the region continued until July of 1792, resumed in October of that year, and were only abandoned in July of 1793 when free movement around the Paris region became impossible, July of 1793. A copy of Linnaeus' Systema Naturae was kept in the meeting room for identifying specimens. The Philomath were also inspired by Linnaeus and took up as a collective project the translation of the Amenitates Academici. Despite Linnaeus' fame and influence, most of his works, written in Latin and Swedish, had not been translated into French. In 1786, Auguste Brussonnet had bemoaned in particular the fact that Linnaeus' quote, Amenitates Academici are not well known. Hardly anyone has read his different voyages. His beautiful preface is full of such beautiful views of nature and never soiled with obviously false assertions. I think actually one of the things that's interesting in that quote is the way in which the aesthetic and the truth go together. It's not soiled with false assertions. The truth is what is beautiful, not some kind of Rousseauian notion of beauty. In February of 1793, the Philomath instructed their secretary to draw up a list of all the dissertations and a plan for translating them. The following week, the first 4 assignments were made, including Cui Bono, a key dissertation on the utility of studying natural history. Since nature was created by God for the use of human beings, Linnaeus' student had written, studying it was obviously useful. Nevertheless, he continued, the ignorant often ridicule those who engaged in observing nature, asking, what purpose does it serve? Quote, these people believe that this science is nothing but pure curiosity. an amusement to pass the time for the carefree and the idlers, he complained. It was to this affront to all those who were dedicated to the study of natural history that he sought to respond with this dissertation. The same affront, as we have seen, was repeated by Rousseau, whose claim to be a Linnaean was thus a blatant travesty. Brongniart. 6 months later, as the convention debated the levée en masse, 23-year-old Alexandre Brongniart, treasurer and co-founder of the Société Philomatique, and one of the earliest members of the Société d'Histoire Naturelle, organized his own field trip in the Paris region, 3 days of botanizing in the forest of Fontainebleau. On their second day in the woods, the naturalists were arrested by local officials when they failed to produce passports authorizing their movement outside of Paris. The local National Guard, Brongniart later told his father, and this was, by the way, the day of the Fête de la Fédération. I guess he took advantage of the holiday. The local National Guard, Brongniart later told his father, placed us in their midst and conducted all three of us, knapsacks on our back and drums beating, to the city of Namur, 2 leagues distant from the place where we were arrested. From Namur, they wrote to their professors at the museum, and a few days later, letters arrived from the mayor of Paris, and they were freed. 3 days after he recounted this adventure in a long letter to his father, Brongniart successfully underwent an oral examination for the position of pharmacy assistant with the army. The next day, the levée en masse was voted into law, so you can see his timing. Less than a month later, Brongniart was on the road to Bayonne, where he had been assigned to serve with the Army of the Pyrenees. Brongniart's description of being marched off to Namur, drums beating, mimics the description of Linnaeus's Herbationes Upsaliensis, an ironic ending to a botanical excursion that ran into a political revolution, and a fitting metaphor, I think, for Brongniart's budding career as a natural historian, which also ran into this revolution. But the Linnaean resonances do not end here. The forest of Fontainebleau, it turns out, was a Linnaean site. When Linnaeus visited Paris in the summer of 1738, he had botanized there with Antoine and Bernard de Jussieu. When the Société d'Histoire Naturelle defined the area they would study around Paris for their excursions, they measured out the distance to Fontainebleau and then drew a circle using it as the radius. Perhaps it was the time that Brongniart spent in the woods and in jail that helped him to convert the threat of conscription into an opportunity to conduct field work beyond the Paris region. As he told his father, "I certainly wish to fulfill my duties as a pharmacist to the letter, but even so, I'm sure that I'll find time to do some natural history, and the country where I'm being sent is so rich that it would be impossible not to do something worthwhile, no matter how little time I can put into it." Moreover, he continued, the war had to end sometime, and the peace that followed would allow him to continue doing field work in the Pyrenees and maybe even the Alps. Those who examined him, some of whom were his colleagues in the Société d'Histoire Naturelle, had the same idea. According to Brongniart, and I'm quoting again, they considered that in sending me to a region that was interesting for natural history, I could, in serving the Republic, acquire new knowledge that could someday perhaps become equally useful. So what I'm arguing here is that a Linnaean understanding of natural history fieldwork is both useful and patriotic, allowed Brongniart to serve his country while serving himself, to seek glory near rather than on the battlefield through the practice of science. Brongniart tried as much as possible to impose a Linnaean framework on an expedition whose purpose was primarily military. He tried to go south on a fourgon, a military van, because he said he would have the pleasure of going on foot and collecting natural history all along the route, since it goes only 2 leagues a day. But the army was in a hurry, so he was forced to take the diligence as far as Bordeaux. In Bayonne, he complained that he had little free time to explore the countryside, and anyway, the weather was lousy. He wrote to his colleagues in the Société Philomatique that he would be happy to turn his hand to translating one of Linnaeus's dissertations, and suggested as his first choice the Instructio Peregrinatoris. Nevertheless, following Linnaeus's dictum in the Instructio to write every day rather than relying on memory, Brongniart filled notebooks with his observations. In late November, he managed to send back to Paris a box full a box of plants he had collected along the road from Bordeaux to Bayonne, and then in the environs of the city itself once he had gotten there. And here I'm quoting him again, "The numbers assigned to each one correspond to my journal," he explained in a letter to François Sylvestre, who was his co-founder and the secretary at that time of the Société Philomatique. "And I would appreciate it if you would make sure that they don't go astray." When the plants arrived, Sylvestre should ask their botanist colleagues, quote, "to identify them and tell you which ones they judge interesting so that I can collect more of them. And if you would send me the list of numbers with the names at the bottom and the observations that will have been made about them, I would be very pleased. And since I have kept a small specimen of each of the plants, I will in this way learn to recognize them, and I will thus know a large part of the plants that grow in the area around Bayonne in this season." Talk faster. By spring, Brongniart had gotten himself transferred to Bagnères, high up in the mountains, where his intention was to do extensive field work before heading back to Paris. His companion on these expeditions would be none other than Auguste Broussonnet, founder of the Société Linnéenne in 1787, and now a Girondin on the run, who was staying with his brother, who was a doctor at a military hospital not far from Bayonne. Over the winter, Brongniart and Broussonnet had dissected various fish and other animals and made plans to explore the mountains together come spring. In late July, Brongniart was again arrested, this time because Broussonnet had taken advantage of one of their excursions to escape over the Spanish border. Brongniart was eventually released, thanks to the intervention of colleagues in Paris, and also because this was right around Neuf Thermidor. It was the 8th, I think, that he was arrested. And he was returned home on the 7th of September, almost a year after his departure. Back in Paris, he joined the Corps des Mines as an inspector of mines because it would allow him to continue to travel and do field work. As he explained to his father, "I will travel 8 months of the year and spend the winter in Paris. It pays 1,000 écus and travel expenses. The 3 agents, the inspectors, the engineers, are almost all members of the Société Philomatique or the Société d'Histoire Naturelle." So the most important of these was the geologist Dolomieu, after whom the Dolomites are named, with whom Brongniart was able to explore the mines and natural history of the Alps in 1795. When he was not in the field, Brongniart continued to be active in the Société Philomatique and the Société d'Histoire Naturelle, and also to teach courses and to organize field trips for his students, as Linnaeus had done. In the spring of 1798, he had the opportunity to join the scientific expedition to Egypt, as many of his colleagues did, but he passed it up. According to Charlotte Coquebert, the wife of his friend and fellow philomath Charles Coquebert, Brongniart spoke about the expedition, quote, "with the ardor that it inspires in everyone who is passionate about the sciences." But it was the Coquebert's son, 17-year-old Ernest, who signed up as a naturalist assistant. Ernest had been raised a Linnaean. He had embarked on his first Linnaean expedition at the age of 8 when he accompanied his father on a trip from Paris to Dublin, where Charles Coquebert was about to take up a diplomatic post as France's trade representative. According to de Candolle, it was on this trip that Ernest's passion for botany emerged. On his family's return in 1791, he took up the formal study of natural history at the Jardin des Plantes, where the founders of the Société Philomatique had met as students in the 1780s. In March of 1794, Ernest's father read parts of his son's translation of Linnaeus's Voyage to West Scotland at a meeting of the Société Philomatique. 2 years later, we know from the minutes that Ernest attended a meeting and participated in it. But what de Candolle, who was 2 years older than Ernest, remembered most fondly was the pleasure they shared in excursions around Paris. Will I ever forget those solitary botanizing walks where, united by a shared passion, we tasted at once the charms of the countryside, study, and friendship. It was through this intimate connection that I learned to appreciate the spirit of observation, exactitude, and perseverance that characterized his judgment, as well as the frankness and firmness of his character. When Ernest heard Brongniart enthusing about the great expedition in the works, he leaped at the chance to take what he was learning from books and build on it out in the field. As de Candolle recalled, instead of limiting himself to following the ideas of Linnaeus, he wanted to imitate him through a voyage undertaken for botany. Candolle, who had done his first botanizing in his native Jura, had come to Paris to study in 1796 at the invitation of Dolomieu. Although on that visit he stayed only a few months, he made friends with two young men, Ernest Coquebert and François Sylvestre's nephew, Henri Bonnard, who shared his passion for natural history. Oh no, it's longer than I thought. Candolle returned to Paris in 1798, just as the Egypt expedition was about to leave, but he decided not to go also. Ernest never made it back from Egypt. In April of 1801, he succumbed to the plague in Cairo. Had he stayed in Paris, he would have had this. He also would have had the opportunity to imitate Linnaeus anyway, because in early June, Brongniart organized another expedition to Fontainebleau, this time with passports in order. The group included both philomaths such as Georges Cuvier and students, among them Candolle and Bonnard. Brongniart was the leader of the group, Candolle later recalled. Each morning we left Fontainebleau under his orders. We crossed the forest methodically, guided by hunting maps and responding to the whistles of our supreme leader. We attacked every branch of natural history simultaneously, unquote. Like Linnaeus, Brongniart had divided the students into teams. Candolle and Bonnard were assigned plants. Brongniart kept a record of the expedition in his journal. Day 3 included a pond rich in microscopic insects and ended, quote, "We returned to Fontainebleau from the direction of the Vallée de la Chambre in single file and marching in step." Hannah Hodach has observed that for Linnaeus, the field was also a social place in which relationships could be established between novices en route to becoming naturalists. This was exactly what it was for Candolle, who saw the experience as formative. And this is my last quote and almost the end. "I had left on this excursion as a young student, unknown and isolated. I returned having heard distinguished men reasoning about their studies, and I had won something of their friendship. I had seen them observing nature, and I had thereby learned from them through practice the difficult art of observation. Nothing was lost on me, neither the botanizing nor the conversation, and today it is to this excursion that I am tempted to say that I owe my career in science." For Brongniart, for his friends and the students he mentored, Linnaean fieldwork was a great pleasure, but it was also central to forming them as men, as scientists, and as citizens in a way that paralleled and drew on the military model that formed so many of their peers. Thank you.